All right, so this lecture series is going to be all about tides and how they are formed and some terminology that's going to help you with an activity that you guys are going to do all about tracking the tides. So the first term that I would like for you all to be familiar with is something called semi-diurnal or semi-diurnal, diurnal meaning day. Semi-diurnal tides are the types of tides that occur when there are two high tides and two low tides during each tidal day. And a tidal day, as you will see a little bit later, a picture of it, is the time from one high tide until the next equally sized high tide. So it could be a few hours, it could be several hours, sort of depends on where you are geographically, as well as what lunar phase you are currently exhibiting, because the pull of the moon definitely affects the formation of tides. In fact, the gravitational pull of the Earth, the moon, and the sun, all three act together to form tides themselves. So semi-diurnal, again, you have two highs and two lows each tidal day. They occur at very regular intervals, so they're very easily predictable. You know when to go fishing and when to go out and when to come back in. And we mostly see this along the Atlantic Ocean, so you'll see it along the coast of Florida on the Atlantic side. And the height of the waves is relatively low, so you're not going to see a huge dramatic difference between low tide and a high tide if you are in a semi-diurnal situation. So diurnal tides are referring to only having one high tide and one low tide during each tidal day. And again, tidal days is not referring to the numbers on a clock. It's really referring to the time that it takes to get from one high tide to another equally sized high tide. There could be some other higher tides in between, but it has to be at equal wavelengths. So diurnal is when you get one high and one low during each tidal day. And again, the water levels don't have much variation, so they're not huge fluctuations between high and low tide. The water levels are relatively constant and a little more gentle. And we see this in places like the Gulf of Mexico. So big difference between the Gulf of Mexico tides and the Atlantic tides. You only get one high during a day, during a tidal day. In the Gulf, where you get two on the Atlantic side. So the third type of tides are called mixed tides because they're a little bit of both. It's characterized by having much wider variation of heights and a mixture of both high and low waters. So basically you get two high and two low waters each day, meaning you could have a high tide and then a low tide and then a really high tide and then a really low tide and then a regular high tide and then a regular low tide. It fluctuates much more dramatically, as you can see in the image here at the bottom of the screen. And these tides are found all over the Pacific Ocean, so the Pacific coastal areas, as well as Alaska and Hawaii, which are in the Pacific, so I guess that would be a little bit unnecessary to say. But any kind of island chain that's in the Pacific is definitely going to see a mixed tide situation, along with any other coastlines along the Pacific. Here's a map that can be kind of a helpful reference. You can wrap your head around where you're seeing these types of tides. Again, as you can look around the entire rim there of the Pacific Ocean, you see mostly an orange color representing the coastlines there. That's because mixed tides are found all over the Pacific Ocean, whereas you get the semi-diurnal in the Atlantic along the coastlines, and then the diurnal is represented there by white, which is in mostly just the northern Pacific and a little bit there towards Malaysia and even the southwest portion of Australia. All right, so take a minute to look at each of these three tide terms of charted depth, depth of water, and height of tide. And those three images there at the bottom of the screen, I think, can really help you visualize everything that we were just discussing with the types of tides. Tidal day, for instance, is featured here in these images by the red lines going up and down vertically. From one red line to the next red line, if you locate the wavelength there of each of the tides, you'll notice that they are located at equal heights. From one high tide to the next high tide, they are equal heights. That is a tidal day. If you look at the semi-diurnal tide, you'll notice that there is a high tide between them, but because it's not quite to the same height in meters, you do not have technically a high tide at that point. It's a higher tide than low tide, but between two equal-sized tides, I feel like I've said the word tides way too many times just now, is what we refer to as a tidal day. So charted depth, the depth of water, height of tide. You've got the vertical distance from the lowest water to the bottom of the ocean. Depth of water can be less than the charted depth, and height of tide is measurement of charted depth to the actual depth. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about are lunar tides. This is essentially focusing on the times during the lunar phases where the moon might have a stronger gravitational pull on the Earth and therefore affect the tides with more ferocity. For instance, spring tides. Spring tides are really, really strong, and they occur when the Earth, the moon, and the sun are all in a line, so basically during a full moon and quarter moon stages as well, kind of right before and right after the full moon. Spring tides make high tides really high and low tides really low. So they're kind of just the extreme tides out of all of the different tides that we have learned about so far today. Neap tides, aside from having just a really fun sounding name, neap tides, they have comparatively they are comparatively weaker tides, especially if you are comparing them to the spring tide. So they have a smaller difference between high and low tides. They are extremely weak compared to the others, and they occur when the sun and the moon are perpendicular to each other rather than in a line, which occur during the moon's quarter phases. So there you have it. All right, so now that you've learned a little bit more about tides, perhaps than you did before coming into this class, you're going to take part in a tide table lab. So tides can be predicted, tracked, and mapped. We can measure the charted height of the water. We can look at whether it's high tide or low tide based off of that. But what exactly would tides look like if you had to draw them out visually? So that's what you're going to be doing. The materials that you need for this lab are colored pencils, graph paper, which I will provide to you, and a tide table from a newspaper or a website or another source also I will provide. The picture that you have here on the screen is an example of a tide table. You've got the dates of the month. This is October of 2001 off of the coast of Cape Porpoise, and it gives you the latitude and longitude degrees there. The date of the month as well as the day of the week are listed on the first column. The second column is a list of all of the high tides and when they occurred, what time of day, as well as their height. And it's not in the metric system because it's the United States and we just cling to that standard feet and inches as much as we possibly can. So you've got the height in feet of the high tide in the second column. And then the third column on the right side is your low tide. So again, the time of day, AM and PM, and the height in feet of exactly how low the tide went. The final column there is a little bit of a cheat. So you probably will not be seeing that on the charts that you get, but it is telling you what phase of the moon it's in, whether it's full moon, half moon, no moon, and that will help you to understand whether it's a spring tide or a neap tide, right? Which is actually part of what you're going to be figuring out in the lab. So you won't be given that answer, but this is just an example of what a tide table could look like. So here are the instructions, and you'll have this in class too. I'm just giving you kind of a quick verbal breakdown of it in case you have any questions. Please do come see me if you do. Otherwise, I'll be around anyway. So with a partner, it's a lot easier if you work with a partner. It's a lot faster if you work with a partner. It's a lot more fun if you work with a partner. You're going to choose 1 month of the year. If you want to make it exactly even, make sure it is a month of the year that has 4 weeks, not 5 weeks. So like June instead of May. If you work with a partner, what you're going to do is you're going to take 2 consecutive weeks of that month, weeks that tie together, and then your partner will take the other 2. And whoever happens to get the end of the month, you just need to graph the 30th and 31st days, if they have 31 days, onto the end of your graph paper. So on the graph paper, what you're going to see a picture of in just a second, I've modified basically a graph paper for you, so it works for this lab. You're going to place the name of the month that you chose at the top and the days of the weeks that you chose at the bottom. The graph, then you're going to graph the tides of your particular day, 1 week at a time. Use a different colored pencil for each week, and then you're going to simply connect the dots with straight lines. Once you are finished, you're going to take a look at the visual that you've created of this predictable, trackable, mappable tide, and you're going to determine where the spring and the neap tides are. Here's an example of what your graph paper is going to look like. This is the tide table lab. You'll have your names, you and your partner's names at the top, the date. You don't have to worry about period. This is an old template. Essentially on the left-hand side there, your x-axis, your y-axis, you've got height in feet, again, because you're going to be getting this in feet, not metric meters. On the x-axis, you have time, and it's broken down by week there. So AM and PM, you're going to have to just fill in basically whatever you chose, whether it's the first and second week of the month, the third and fourth week of the month, and then mark your days of the week down as you go. So that is your assignment. Now that you have completed the video, I want you to go ahead and submit a comment saying completed on Schoology, and then come see me for the materials that you'll need for the lab. Thank you.